This is another video in the series of examining the depth time controls within the TIPS well log modeler. So in previous videos we showed how we specify the two-way travel time from the surface down to the start of our well log. We've also imported check shot data and used the check shot data to determine that time. And we've also shown how we use the check shot correction to the sonic to get our depth time relationship through the entire well log. Sometimes there are a few other things that we need to look at when we're talking about the depth and time. I'm going to go back to this menu where we have synthetics set depth time controls just to refresh where we were. So in this particular example we had a check shot which is taken from the surface, and we have that two-way travel time all the way down, and we're using that check shot to get our start time at the top of the well. In this case that well measured depth, the first value is 680 feet, which is told to us up top. And our elevation reference is 50 feet above the surface for this example. And so we showed how we can make these changes, and we can check the button down here to use or not use the check shot correction to generate our seismic synthetics. The other thing that we have down here that we haven't touched on, generally speaking you won't use it when you're just looking at AVO data and 1D synthetics, without seismic data. So they generally aren't applicable, but the minute you start doing well ties, they probably will become applicable. And one of them is the static time shift. And what that is, after we've done all this, applied our check shot, determined the start time, there are times when we may just need to shift the whole synthetic up and down in order to tie with our synthetic. No stretch and squeeze at this point, just shifting the whole thing up and down. So we could enter a value in here of a shift and then go to our 1D and our AVO, and that shift would be applied. But really this is something that is generally going to be dictated by well ties. So I'm going to close this window. We have a seismic data down here. If you have not watched the series of videos on well ties, I would suggest you do so. The one thing to keep in mind is every well tie has its own depth time controls. So we have depth time controls up here for all of the synthetics that we'll be creating. But when you get into the well ties, based on the seismic data, the state of the seismic data, the references of the seismic data, things may be different. So when we go into the seismic data, and I'm going to right mouse on this node and hit open well tie, and this menu pops up where we have seismic data. Our well synthetic with some formation markers has been placed in here. We can see across the bottom our log start time is 0.231 seconds. Our check shot correction has been applied, no stretch and squeeze, and no time shift. That's that static time shift. Just like in the other synthetics, we can, if we do have a check shot applied, we can go to View, Show Check Shot Markers, and it'll drop the little markers directly on our synthetic so that we can see them if we like. I'm going to turn those off so that because they'll get a little bogged down in this particular example. Now, in this example, we have a mark here that's it's called Mark A is the first one. And we know from the geology and what's going on up shallow that this large event coming across here at about 0.8 of a second right here, that is really the formation Mark A. So our synthetic needs to be shifted so that that formation top is defined on the synthetic lines up with what's in our seismic data. So what we need to do is just a static shift. We're not changing the underlying depth time profile except the fact that we're moving everything up. In this case up. We can move the synthetic up or down. So we see down at the bottom that we have no time shift applied. That's our static shift. All right, if we want to move this up, there's several ways to do it. Now under the well menu at the top of this seismic display, I can click on well and I have set depth time controls, and I have the same menu up here. And again, this is unique to this particular well tie, with the understanding that the state of the seismic data for different lines may be different. So that's why they all have their own characteristic. But by default, we're pulling over what we had in our main menu, which was using the check shot start time and using the check shot correction throughout. and we have a static shift of 0. And a positive value here, as it notes here, moves the synthetic down. I'm going to close this window because there's another way to do it, which is a little more palatable. Across this toolbar here, we have well controls. Again, the toolbars are defined, we've got seismic, well, and wavelet. So under the well controls, we have a button here that allows us to move the well synthetic to the left or right on our seismic line. But this is shift trace up and shift trace down. And I can simply click this button and you'll notice that my synthetic starts to move up. And down here, the time shift up is 0.009 seconds. It's going to, every time you click it, it's going to go up by what the sample rate is. So I'm going to keep moving this up, and you can actually hold the mouse button down and it'll continue to move up. And so I'm going to keep moving this up until that mark A gets lined up with that event that we know is the geological time, and right there. So now we can see we've got this nice continuity going across. I'll hide my formations just so that we can see that we have here. I'll turn them back on. Okay, so now we've adjusted that. So I have a time shift up of down here of just over 1/10 of a second. Okay, so this is what we're going to use. And if I go back to my well set depth time controls, I can see that I have a minus 0.102 right here. So now we've gone through and we're going to say this is the depth time characteristic. We've got the check shot applied. We're using the check shot data to get our initial start time for the start of our synthetic. But then in order to tie up with this particular model, because we don't really know the reference of where the seismic was taken and specifics of that, but we want to make sure that we have this ability to preserve the synthetic in the check shot data that was done, but just shift it so that we're getting it tied with our seismic data. One last thing that we can do here is, let's say for this particular well, I'm going to go to set depth time controls. There's a button down here that says use defaults. Okay, now we haven't set any defaults right now. So let's say that we believe the proper depth time controls that should be used throughout this application is as specified down here. Okay, we started at 0.231 seconds, which is determined by the check shot. We've applied the check shot, no stretch and squeeze, and we've shifted the trace up. I can go to well, set current depth time as the default. Okay, so now this has been set as the default. Now I'm going to close this menu, and when I go back to the main menu, let's recall, so now that well tie, I'm going to preserve its time depth relationship, and it will be there, and you can always modify it. But when I go to synthetics, set depth time controls in the main menu for all AVO modeling, wedge modeling, whatever I might want to be doing down here, I do not have a static time shift. Okay, so I'm using the check shot. If I want to, I could come in here and type in if I remembered what that 0.102 was, or I could just say use defaults because I set those well tie settings as my default. And when I hit use defaults, it's then going to pop that in there. For instance, if I was messing around previously and this is what I had, and then I said, and I was running my synthetics and AVO models, but I wanted to use my defaults, I would click this, and now it says, nope, the default is to use the check shot start time, use the check shot correction, but then shift everything down just over 1/10 of a second. And then when I'm in this menu and I go to my 1D models, this time will correlate, and all these events we know will correlate exactly with what's in that well tie. So we've created this well log, and then we've shifted it. We told it to start at 0.231 seconds, but then we've shifted it up another 1/10 of a second, which is what you can see right here. So that is how we apply a static shift to our depth time controls. I would suggest the next thing you do is check out the video on stretch and squeeze, which is the last component of the depth time controls between the well log and the synthetics.